Buckingham Palace was supposed to be a fortress of discipline, tradition, and unshakable order. But on one fateful afternoon that order was threatened. A mysterious man, ranting about the monarchy's downfall, breaks through the crowd, charging toward the front gates of the palace. Tourists scream, guards remain motionless, security tenses, and then one royal guard moves. Buckingham Palace stood as it always had, a symbol of power, tradition, and unwavering order. The grand gates gleamed under the afternoon sun, the Union Jack swayed lazily in the wind, and a sea of tourists milled about, laughing, taking photos, soaking in the grandeur of the historic site. It was a perfect day in London. And then, something shifted. At first, nobody noticed him. Just another man in the crowd, moving between groups of tourists, blending in among the thousands who visited the palace every day. But something was off. He wasn't admiring the architecture. He wasn't taking pictures. He was talking to himself. Softly at first, his lips moving in nonsensical whispers, eyes darting around like a predator sizing up its prey. A woman near him nudged her husband. "That guy's acting weird," she murmured. Her husband barely glanced up from his phone. Probably just another street performer. But she wasn't convinced, and neither was the royal guard standing less than 50 feet away. To the average tourist, the guards of Buckingham Palace were like statues, unmoving, unfeeling, silent. But beneath the stillness, beneath the perfectly polished uniforms and rigid posture, these men were soldiers, trained to notice every flicker of movement, every change in energy, every potential threat. And now, one of them had noticed him. Without a single movement, without so much as shifting his gaze, the royal guard locked on to the man, watching, waiting. The first real sign of trouble came in an instant. 1 second, the man was standing in the crowd, muttering to himself. The next, he was running, straight toward the gates of Buckingham Palace. Tourists screamed as the man burst forward, shoving past people, knocking over a child's stroller, sprinting with terrifying speed. Gasps, shouts. Phones were yanked into the air, cameras scrambling to record. A security officer near the front gate fumbled for his radio, but they weren't fast enough. Nobody was, except for one man, one royal guard, and for the first time in hours, he moved. Thump! The royal guard's boot hit the pavement, one single earth-shaking step forward. The rifle shifted slightly. The tourists fell silent, and then everything exploded into motion. The world seemed to slow down as the man sprinted toward the gates of Buckingham Palace. His feet pounded against the pavement, his body lurching forward with reckless abandon. His mouth was moving, but his words were lost in the chaos, muffled by the screams, the gasps, the rising panic in the air. The crowd scattered, people tripping over themselves to get out of his way. A woman yanked her child back, nearly dropping her phone. An elderly couple froze in terror, their faces pale with shock. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a lost tourist. This was a man on a mission. And in front of him, standing directly between the charging madman and the gates of Buckingham Palace, was one royal guard. The royal guard had already moved, not in panic, not in hesitation, but with the kind of calm, precise control that only came from relentless training. 1 step forward, rifle shifting slightly. To the average tourist, it looked like a minor adjustment. But to those who knew, to those who understood military discipline, it was a warning, the first and last. And the man running toward him either didn't notice or didn't care. For a single, breathless second, the charging man and the royal guard locked eyes. The madman's face was wild, his pupils blown wide, his lips curled into a twisted snarl. But the guard? Unshaken, unmoved, cold as steel. The gap between them shrunk in an instant. 30 feet, 20, 10, and then the guard reacted. And London would never forget what happened next. For a single electrified second, the entire world froze. The air around Buckingham Palace, once filled with the chatter of tourists, the clicking of cameras, the distant hum of London streets, had been completely swallowed by silence. Because now, all that remained was the unstoppable force of a madman charging forward, and the immovable discipline of a royal guard standing in his way. He had been trained for this moment. Not this exact scenario, no. No one could have predicted this. But for years, this soldier had stood in the Queen's, now King's, guard, learning to be unshakable, unreadable, indomitable in the face of chaos and challenge. Every single day, tourists had tried to push him, provoke him, humiliate him, make him flinch. But he had never moved, never broken, because he wasn't just a man in a uniform. He was the last line of defense. And now, with a full-grown man barreling toward him, the time for discipline had passed. Now it was time to neutralize the threat. The madman closed the final 10 feet in a blink. His mouth was moving wildly, spit flying as he screamed, words lost in the chaos. His hands jerked at his sides, reaching for something, though it was unclear what. A weapon? A distraction? It didn't matter. The guard didn't wait to find out. In a single controlled motion, thump! The guard's boot slammed down, his entire stance shifting into an offensive position. It was the first full step he had taken in hours. But it was enough to change everything. The rifle, polished, gleaming in the afternoon sun, moved. Not wildly, not recklessly, but with military precision. He didn't raise it like a firearm. He didn't need to. Instead, he used it like a shield, like a weapon, like an extension of his body. With one brutal motion, the butt of the rifle swung up and forward, the heavy wood and steel slamming directly into the charging man's chest. A perfect strike, executed with lethal efficiency. The force of it was instantaneous. The man's body jerked violently, his forward momentum stopping dead in its tracks as all the air in his lungs was ripped away in an instant. For a split second, his eyes went wide with shock, and then he collapsed. The moment the rifle connected, it was over. The man's feet left the ground, his body flipping backward, crashing into the pavement with a sickening thud. The crowd gasped as one, the sound of hundreds of voices merging into a single stunned exhale. Phones zoomed in. Cameras shook as people struggled to capture what had just happened. A woman near the front clutched her chest, whispering, "Oh my God." A man muttered, "Did he just—" A child's voice, small but clear, cut through the silence. "He stopped him." For the next few seconds, nothing happened. The man didn't move. Just lay there, sprawled out on the pavement, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Security finally reacted, officers surging forward, shouting commands, swarming the fallen figure. A police officer grabbed the man's wrists, forcing them behind his back as another pinned his legs down. The man let out a strangled cough, his chest still heaving from the blow. His hands twitched weakly, but he was done fighting. Whatever he had been planning, it had ended the moment he ran into the guard's rifle. And the royal guard, he had already reset. The guard had taken one step, one strike, one movement to eliminate the threat. And now, just as quickly, he returned to his post. His boot shifted back into position, rifle lowered into its original stance, his face blank, unreadable, untouchable, like it had never happened, like he hadn't just single-handedly stopped a full-grown man in the middle of a charge, like he hadn't just become a legend in front of hundreds of witnesses. His expression remained cold, disciplined, indifferent, as if the entire thing had been just another day on duty. And in that moment, the world understood the power of the Royal Guard, unshakable, unstoppable, unmatched, a force of history standing against chaos, and winning every single time. The scene outside Buckingham Palace had transformed from a bustling tourist attraction to a lockdown zone in a matter of seconds. The royal guard had moved, something that rarely happened outside of ceremonial duties, and in doing so, he had shattered every misconception about his role. Now the world was watching. Police officers surged forward, pushing through the stunned crowd as they descended on the man still sprawled on the pavement. "Stay down! Hands where we can see them!" one officer barked, kneeling on the man's back as he struggled for breath. The would-be intruder twitched weakly, groaning, his chest still heaving from the brutal impact of the rifle butt. He had gone from charging with reckless intent to crumpled on the ground in the span of a heartbeat. And now, he wasn't a threat anymore, just another fool who had underestimated the king's guard. A wave of whispers and murmurs rolled through the mass of tourists. Some people were still clutching their chests, their bodies tense from the surge of adrenaline. Others had their phones locked on the scene, broadcasting the moment in real time to the entire world. One man muttered, "Did he just take him out with a single move?" A woman holding a camera to her face whispered, "I thought they weren't allowed to react." Someone else corrected her immediately. "They can when there's a threat." But no one, not a single person, questioned whether the guard's reaction had been justified. Because everyone had seen it. Everyone had felt it. This wasn't a harmless prank gone wrong. This was a man running full speed toward Buckingham Palace. And one soldier stopped him. The police had everything under control now. Officers were restraining the suspect, dragging him away, radioing in reports. Tourists were still murmuring, replaying what had just happened, some trying to explain it to their friends, others still too stunned to form words. But the most surreal part? The royal guard, the man who had just put an end to the chaos, was already back in position. He stood tall, rifle in place, shoulders squared, his eyes locked ahead as if nothing had ever happened. Not a single muscle twitched. Not a single sign of emotion or adrenaline. It was as if he had never moved at all. The only evidence that he had just dropped a man in one strike? The whispering crowd, the videos already going viral, and the unconscious fool being hauled away by London's finest. As the tension lingered in the air, a small voice rose up from the silence. A young boy, no older than 8 or 9, standing near the front of the crowd, looked up at his mother with wide eyes. His voice was barely a whisper, but somehow it carried. "Mom, he protected the palace." The mother blinked, looking at her son, then back at the guard. She nodded, her voice soft, filled with something between awe and pride. "Yes, sweetheart, he did." By the time the police escorted the man away, the first videos had already hit social media, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, millions of views within minutes. Headlines were already forming. Royal Guard takes down intruder in one move. Some debated whether the guard had used too much force. Most, however, had just one reaction: respect. Because in a world where so many people saw the royal guards as nothing more than silent statues, this moment had reminded them of the truth. They weren't just there to stand still. They were there to defend. And today, that's exactly what had happened. Without hesitation, without fear, without breaking a single rule. The royal guard had spoken, and he hadn't needed to say a single word. By the time the suspect was fully restrained and dragged away by the police, Buckingham Palace had returned to its usual rhythm. Tourists were still gathered at the gates, some whispering in hushed tones, others replaying the footage on their phones. But the royal guard? He was already back in position, unshaken, unmoved, untouched by the chaos that had unfolded just minutes ago. If you had arrived 1 minute too late, you never would have known that anything had happened at all. Except now, the entire world knew. Before the suspect was even placed into the police van, the first videos were already uploaded. One post on Twitter, X, read, "Holy sh*t, the Royal Guard just dropped some guy trying to rush Buckingham Palace. Didn't even hesitate. One move. Done." Attached to it was a 15-second clip, shaky from the person's trembling hands, but perfectly capturing the moment the guard reacted. Within minutes, it had hundreds of thousands of views, then millions. TikTok picked it up next. The algorithm ate it up like wildfire. Edits popped up, slowed down replays, dramatic music overlays, captions that read, "You thought they were just for show?" One video, clipped together like an action movie trailer, racked up over 10 million views in less than an hour. The internet had officially crowned a new legend. As always, the world split into two sides. Some people called the Royal Guard a hero. Others, as expected, started questioning if it was too much force. But anyone who had actually been there knew the truth. The suspect had been charging at the gates, full speed, screaming something unintelligible. No one knew his intentions. And if the guard hadn't acted in that exact second, he might have reached the gates. He might have done something worse. That wasn't a risk worth taking, and the Royal Guard didn't take risks. He took action. The British government? No official statement. The palace? Not a word. The Royal Guard regiment? Absolute silence, because they didn't need to say anything. The video spoke for itself. They had done what they were trained to do. End of discussion. Days later, as the video continued to dominate headlines, a reporter outside Buckingham Palace interviewed a tourist who had been there when it happened. The reporter asked, "What was the most surprising thing about it all?" The tourist thought for a second, then said, "The fact that he never even looked at the guy after. He just reset, like nothing happened." And that was what made the Royal Guard legendary. Because to the world, this was an unbelievable moment. But to him, it was just another day on duty, unshaken, unbroken, always watching, always ready, because that's what the Royal Guard does. And this was proof.